And thank you all for being here this afternoon. I thought I'd open with a few framing remarks and then invite each of our distinguished panelists to engage with some of these questions. The topic suggested that there was a possibility that the arts could rein in the rogue passions of the day. And it seems to bring to mind a debate that has been with us across societies and periods. The idea that art somehow is a refinement of the spirit, it's ameliorative, it speaks to all that is fine within the human spirit, and that to that extent it could be one of the guarantees that we have against everything that threatens us. And whether it's in India today, the US in recent weeks, Central Europe, practically everywhere, there's been this upsurge that is going to define our lives now for the next decade, if not longer, in which a certain kind of populism, a certain kind of appeal to all that is defensive, there's a kind of defensive-aggressive sort of set of syndromes that are being appealed to. And over against that is a fragmented, at least it seems to me, in a mood of pessimism. So this kind of fragmentary, episodic, reactive kind of response to that. And certainly in India, we've been in this place before. I'm thinking of 1992, particularly after Ayodhya. How did the artistic community respond? How do we respond to crises on that magnitude? How do we respond to these difficulties and these vexations in everyday life? So this is the kind of canvas that I hope we can explore, because I want to really draw all three of you out on your own practices and then build to these larger, more abstract seeming questions. So I'm actually going to begin with you, Katha, if I may. We were speaking yesterday of how you're from Lübeck in the high north of Germany, the city of the Mann family, and then you've had a journey that has taken you to different parts of Central Europe and eventually to India. Could I ask you to speak to these different contexts in terms of how the arts might contribute to strengthening what is most effective what is most affirmative in society? Maybe in terms of the work you did at the HKW in Berlin and the kind of community-oriented work that you're involved with in Goa right now?
Okay. I think the arts are very important because there's so many languages that are spoken. So it's it's very easy to build cultural bridges through arts, whether it is music, which is the most easy, I guess, but also through visual arts, you can kind of start a communication. It can be very political, it can be very unpolitical, but you can build a kind of communication that might be more difficult in the academics or in other fields where you try to build bridges and to connect to other communities or other cultures. So in a way, I think, having traveled myself a lot, having lived in different cultures and continents, migration or being disembodied in a way from your own culture helps. It helps to understand other cultures. It also helps to kind of find your own shadow sides, to see your own culture in a different light, see the strength of your own culture also. So all of that is then, in a way, can be expressed in visual arts in very flexible manners. So for me, it is finding new visual bodies, that's how I call it, to talk to people who are different than I am in a way. So I'm trying to get subjects across that matter to me. In the case that was just mentioned, the exhibition, it's all about womanhood, about Shakti, about sensuality. How does it differ in a continent than Europe compared to India? Yeah, that's one thing. The other thing is social consciousness. I think we all have to be very, very conscious with each other. And for me, art again is a means where you can connect. For example, I have an NGO called Tara Trust where we work with arts and children. So this is not just to bring fun to children. It means to open them up to their own imagination. And if you open yourself up to your imagination, if you realize there's a lot inside you, whether it's through theater that it's expressed, or music, or painting, you start to build a vision. You start to build a vision that actually, whatever you want to achieve in life, you can walk towards it. Doesn't necessarily mean you achieve it, but you suddenly have a new tool to navigate the world. And I think the arts are a very, very strong tool to do that. And in that sense, in rough times politically, whatever way one goes, I think the arts it's very helpful.
Thank you so much, Katha. I'm going to take those thoughts with me now to Vidya, if I may. At least partly because there is, in some parts of the cultural establishment, there is a feeling that music, particularly classical music, whether Hindustani and Carnatic, now under the determined assault of our friend T.M. Krishna, people are a little less certain of that, but of the Carnatic anyway. But there is a kind of default understanding that the classical forms of music are, if not entirely timeless, they're somehow abstract, they are apolitical, or should be kept away from the political. But in your work and in the work of a number of your contemporaries, there has been a wrestling with this. So could I ask you to speak to these questions? Particularly, I'm thinking of the last 25 or 30 years when, for instance, gender discourse has become quite manifest in the work of a number of musical practitioners, also thinking here of Vidya Rao with the Tumri, your own work. Could you maybe explore that question for us?
See, classical music, the way it has evolved, Indian classical music, whether it is Carnatic music or the North Indian genres of Dhrupad or Khayal, which are the most established in terms of practice in today, the way they have evolved has, there's been a very deep connection with the patron always. And yes, to the extent that the artist is expected to engage with his practice in a very sort of, in an intense, lonely sort of a way, and therefore there is an assumption that the social context is not really a part of this process. But having said that, the flip side is there is a patron, there is this person out there who is deciding in what form and in what direction it should be nurtured, evolved, developed, and supported. So it has, considering that it's lasted over 400-500 years, clearly it has a certain resilience, it has an appeal, it works at many levels. It started out as, Dhrupad, for instance, came out of temples, and it had a definite religious aspect to it. Khayal, on the other hand, was for the courts. So it had an entertainment value to it. But I think over the years, these categories of what the art practice is essentially existing for keeps redefining itself. And in the current context, to me, the challenge is, the tendency to hold on to something called traditional, which makes it a little more, which makes it a little stiff. It becomes a little starched, that it should be this, it is, therefore you can't meddle with it or you can't shift it around. So I think it's important to see how it has evolved. The shifting has always happened. There has been a process of, absorbing, the North learnt a lot from the South tradition and vice versa. That kind of osmosis has always existed in traditional music. And I think somewhere along the line, we've lost that plot, and we tend to sort of freeze it at some spot, which makes it very hard, therefore, to create that elbow space. And I don't know if that's what you were asking me about. So there are these challenges, and having said that, it is the connoisseur's delight, it is the purest delight. So it's going to be here for a long time, I think.
I'll come back to
the gender question, sorry, that's the other thing. also the way we have looked at, say, performance, gender, its interface with technology, even that has changed. It has gone through phases. So we had a very rich courtesan culture, where it was expected for women to learn, train, perform, and their very reason to celebrate their existence was the performance, And then, there's always been political overtones which control the idea of entertainment, or how women should be allowed or should not be allowed, or only certain kind of women should be allowed. That discourse, I think, there are some of us in contemporary India who question it, but I think the fact that that gender construct in the context of performance has changed has more to do with what you mentioned earlier about a certain kind of a populism which is coming into the context of music itself.
Lionel, I'm going to turn to you now with some of these thoughts as well, because there is a way in which populism can be an extremely aggressive, intolerant, exclusionary form. But on the other hand, you do need forms of collective action which are premised more on solidarity. And it seems to me that your practice comes very strongly out of that ground. But I wonder if you'd like to tell us about the pressures that you work with. On the one hand, as a poet, you are working out of your very particular subjectivity. On the other, there is all that part of your life and practice that has to do with battling injustice of in fact, of kind of a hereditary nature. And how do you negotiate those two roles? So perhaps also if you could spell out, I don't in any sense want you to be a kind of country representative or a reporter from a situation, but if you could spell out a little for us the context of belonging to the First Nations in Australia and how this has shaped and contoured your work as a poet and an activist.
Jinky Walu, that's mean hello in my language, and thank you for letting me be here. In terms of the arts in Aboriginal Australia have been around for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, it's only been about 250 years, or in places only 150 years in Australia. And what they have done since they came to our country is destroy our art, destroy our land, destroy our language. But we revitalised to about, maybe you say 3% in Australia did now at the moment. They tried to really wipe us out in reserves. I come from a mission reserve where they brought about 27 different tribes into one zone, for example, like the reserve where I'm from, the mission where I'm from, and not allow us to speak our language. I grew up with whisper language. You have to whisper around the campfires. You have to do artwork around the campfires. But when the tourists or when the manager came up the laneway to see our artwork, we have to chuck it in the fire to hide it from him. Otherwise, he'd take it for the tourists. And so over all these years, like, let's say in the last 100 years, 150 years, art in Australia has been prostituting to the Aboriginal culture in the country there. Prostituting for the fact that a lot of the governmental, political, apologetic, contemporary way of trying to unite people together in a passionate way of reconciliation is not really working in the country of our country. And that's why a lot of our detribalised or can't speak language or can't do art have to have to coincide with news in English. I mean, English is a second tongue to a lot of people, is a second kind of thing, but we have to use it as a tool. And with that tool, we see it as a direction of getting rid of oppression, getting rid of the hatred and the racism that's in there, because racism in Australia is so prevalent that it doesn't allow the art of authenticity to happen. In society, what they do is they grab a lot of our might as say, big art, and take it into there, and they culturally, politically prostitute it within society. On the grassroots, all the people are crying out for it, right? Then you got all these experts over the years, white experts in Australia. I'm talking about, we call them Migalus, we call them Dugais in Australia. They are experts on a lot of Aboriginal language and arts, and they sell it to the world, and they sell it to Australia. In the grassroots in Australia, where all the minority of Aboriginal people are, they're struggling to revitalise it, to dance it up, to sing it up, to even do the paintings. And we find that other people within society have been using our culture who are not in Aborigine, who are not Indigenous of Australia, and using our culture to sell it around the world and to sell it in Australia. This we find is like an exploitation of our art in Australia. So you find that a lot of our people, a lot of my people in Australia, the First Nations of Australia, First Peoples of Australia, we kind of protest against that. We don't like those people doing that. And so the way we protest about revitalising our art or to maintaining our authentic art in Australia after the 200 years, right? The way we protest is we go onto the street and we protest in terms of the arts that's being dead by locking up all our people in jails, in detention centres, and outside in society. The enforcers of society are just so much bad within our community at the moment that it causes depression, anxiety, low levels of pride and everything like that. It destroys our dignity and integrity. So a lot of us young people who know bits and pieces of our language, we go back to our fluent speaking languages, which is only very small in the north part, in the central, and in the western of Australia in bits and pieces. We go and grab them, and we try to revitalise our own language and things. But at the moment, I think that in terms of the arts, in terms of stopping pressure between us and them, is writing. This is a new form of contemporary art for us, to use writing in English, but in our own language. That's just coming available at the moment, where we're starting to write in our own language. And that's a form of art for us, in terms of writing in our own language. Painting, that's been around for years for us. In terms of the contemporary way, we use the old traditional paintings to bring it up to date. But to us, when we do painting or when we do any kind of visual art or anything like that, it has to be danced, it has to be sung, and it's like writing to us. You have to sing it. I think I answered you a little bit on that. But in terms of Australia, I mean, Australia has gone backward, it's not gone forward with the arts. You talk about primitive capitalism. Primitive capitalism is happening in the country in Australia now.
Lionel, thank you very much, because, I mean, that was a really moving portrait of what forms of primitive accumulation, as you were gesturing towards, and this kind of persisting racial asymmetry, what it can do to the culture.
I think black Aborigine culture in Australia, we're going to save the arts for the contemporary non-Indigenous Australians, and it's a way of saying that the politics in Australia, if it clashes with our art in Australia, it's not going to work as much as the culture that's inside it, that brings forward with the contemporary. I mean, politics is something that really can't blend with our art that much. Only way it can blend is when we expose the unnatural things that happen in the land, especially the destruction of the land and the environmental destructions around the countries, like the Great Barrier Reef. Just recently, they said that it's a dead barrier reef up the east coast of Australia. I mean, to us, it's not dead. That's our heart. It's going to live. To them, it's dead. You know, it's like the climate changes in Australia. Our land will always live and relive as the heart will do. But to them, in politics, it's dying, and we have to care more for it. But I believe that the arts will overcome it.
Thank you. Katha, that leads almost, by a strange detour, it leads to your life world in a way. Because Goa, which is where I partly grew up, I see that it has a great cultural vibrancy. It's also nourished by people who've always been there, people who've migrated there, moved there, like yourself and Sudhir, for instance. And at the same time, there is tremendous political unrest. I mean, there's a political unrest in terms of accelerated right-wing activity, and there is the motif of the mining, the environmental damage. So would concerns of this kind color what you do with children, with the community, and how and to what extent? And do you see yourself as a cultural activist, and how would you allow these questions to come into what you do?
I find it always a little bit difficult with these labels, cultural activist and so on. But yes, in that sense, I feel I am, because I think the arts in general are or can be, not necessarily, but can be a tool for cultural activism, to build consciousness. So what do we do actually when we are expressing ourselves through art? It is trying to address certain issues that matter. And coming back to the environmental destruction through mining, which is a huge issue in Goa, I've picked it up in my writing. The mining issue is not something that we've done or worked with the children, but very much local so-called issues, water, garbage, things the children can relate to because it's part of their environment, part of what they see in their destruction. One group of children came up with a very cute animation film that they made, where the fish went to the doctor and the doctor was a cat and things like that. To cut it short, in the end it was like they pointed out, and they bring these up from, I mean, we don't do anything. It's their stories that come out. It's like we have to teach the tourists not to throw the garbage into the sea, so that the fish does not get sick. So these issues kind of build then consciousness among the children, and in that sense, yes, we are, through our work, also cultural activists.
I'm going to take that same line of thought to you, Vidya, because there is everything that is, I would have said, studio or the music room, where you are working with yourself, what you characterized as the lonely aspect of practice. But when it comes to sociality, pedagogy, could you talk a little bit about how you extend yourself? Because there's one of the things that a guru might do in the classic Guru Shishya tradition is to pass on the secrets of the gharana. But today it's not only the repertoire of bandishes and all that is truly important and vital about the practice, but it's also the questions that surround the practice. So in what way would you articulate that to your students or?
See, I feel that, music has many things to say. So, in the Guru Shishya Parampara itself, it's actually a very, and I might be taken to task for saying this, but it's a fairly, it's a fairly discriminatory practice, actually, if you look at it, because for one thing, it's a very male-dominated system. As are most other, aspects of performance art. But having said that, the fact is that determines the transfer of knowledge. It determines in what manner music is coming down traditionally. And so you have your guru, and there's a hierarchy there. So there's the guru's son, perhaps, then maybe the guru's son-in-law. So women are actually really at the lowest rung of this hierarchy. And if you look at the repertoire of some of these bandishes, what it might have been subsequently changed a little. They were tweaked around, they were edited, so for various social, political reasons. And some of the women were not even taught the entire bandish. They were not taught the entire composition because it was a bit dodgy for the guru to teach. There was a point in this tradition where the women who were learning from these ustads were not necessarily from, they were those women, let's just say. And so it was not, it was not the done thing to give, to hand this tradition over to them. So it was done in an edited, very sort of a considered sort of a way. And so the bandish was not fully taught to the woman. So she would be taught the sthai, the first two lines, and then she was left, she would be left to deal with the antara herself, and she would concoct something and sing, or they would end up learning from their sarangi ustads. So there have been these, the parampara itself has certain challenges, but right now, I mean, since we have much more access to listening to music, all those lines are blurring a bit, Because for one thing, what was really dogmatic, what was absolutely sacrosanct, as was in the gharana system or your school to which you belong to, those lines are blurring now. You listen to any kind of music and you can bring it into your, And I think a lot of us who come from contemporary urban backgrounds want to feel pushed by this, want to feel challenged by this. And so even within tradition, I may be singing an Agra Bandish or something else, or I may be working with a musician from a completely different background and not feel guilty about it, and not feel guilty about it. So I think there is, again, it's kind of a reverse. This used to happen earlier also. People performed all kinds of music earlier, and then there came a time where it all became much more rigorous and much more modular in which the manner in which you listen to music or practiced or learned it. So that is beginning to blur a little more. For instance, if you look at reality shows on television today, I mean, I hope I'm not completely deviating from your question. No, I make that point not because I don't want to pass a judgment on the show. I'm not getting into that. But I'm going to talk about the language that is used in the shows. So you have judges who come from, I mean, they're all brilliant musicians. They're listening to some brilliant singers on those shows. But the language that they use is very much from the classical idiom. बहुत अच्छी मुर्की थी, तान बहुत अच्छी लगाई आपने, वो मीन ठीक नहीं थी. So, there is a certain space, respect, a certain kind of a respectability, let's say, to that tradition, which people want to borrow and use in other forms, which I think it'll be interesting to see the long-term impact of something like this, of how it may change the language or the fabric of how we define traditional, therefore.
That kind of leads me to you, Lionel, this question of I wouldn't say the collision, but the encounter among very different cultural repertoires or vocabularies. And yesterday, we had this discussion with S. Anand and Venkatraman Sham, which had also to do with a community that's historically been marginalized. And it has a dual political responsibility, if you will. It needs to secure its own notion of identity, but also find expansive ways of belonging in the world. So could I maybe draw you out on that predicament if you face it too? And I'm also thinking in terms of how cultural institutions in Australia might work. There's one notion of the contemporary, which is premised on what ultimately is a Euro-American idea of modernity and the contemporary in the arts. And your struggle with the First Nations, the indigenous peoples, are struggling to retain a living archive of what you inherit anyway. So how do you negotiate between these two different spaces, to use Vidya's term?
Well, I think that most of the time, like who define what's art, A-R-T, to us, and we think to ourselves, in the old times and in the present day, people come in and they say, oh, that's an art form, what they're doing. But that's their living life. I mean, it's like poetry to them. It's a flow. You can't even put a word or a name on it to say that's an art contemporary thing. It's just a poetical flow of their life, of what they do each day. Fishing, hunting, gathering, and family gathering, doing a revitalized song or another song, another dance. This is all not art. This is poetry. It's living life poetry that goes on. But in terms of Australia at the moment, it's like the language. It's revitalizing in small bits and pieces, like in the southern part of Australia, in Sydney area, inland from Sydney and down Melbourne, up in Brisbane, all them areas there where they first invaded our country. Our people in those areas, the Koreas, the Murrays, we all starting to revitalise in what that poetical authenticity in the flow from our dream time in the present day, in reality. But we still have to look at what's happening to our people in the present day. And that's when the political arts come in. And a lot of our people are very well known in acting, dancing, and doing art in the political sense, and also writing, because we find that a lot of the anthologies, archaeologies of Australia have been so discriminative to our people, as well as not our people, but to normal Australian people in terms of not telling them the truth. For example, in Australia, we're a minority, yeah, but we're still not recognised under the Constitution of Australia. They're still trying to ratify their own understanding of what is a art and what is a living art and an authenticity in the art of language and the living of it. They can't work out that we're still trying to revitalise in areas where they cause destruction to us, and where our people who are speaking the fluent language and the fluent art are doing it, they putting onto them Greek art, they putting onto them European art, they putting onto them, you have to learn English because you got to learn English art, or you got to learn this kind of Indonesian art, Indian art, right? You got to learn all of that before you can get anywhere to get a job, right? Or to get employment, or things like that. So that leaves us still in that minority little box back here to go forward. And so, but in Australia, things have changed in slight little ways in terms of the people have changed, but the structural kind of oppression and divisionalism and racism is so prevalent in Australia through that laws of what they have. The laws in Australia are the ones that force us to cut our tongues, cut our throats, and also to force us to split our families, take away our generation. It's the laws, basically. It's not so much the people on the ground or the community itself. It's the laws in society. And I find that that's where the arts are not destructive for us. The arts is a profit-making business for them in society. And we have to be careful, us as artists and intelligent people that understand the society overall, that our younger people that are coming up don't have to get caught into those things there where you become commercialism in art. And the commercialism in art takes away the community vibe, the community spirit. And but the spirit of it is basically where they can't put foreign religion on us, right? In Australia, what they do is they have a hatred towards Muslim people. We have this Pauline Hanson and a few other people who are like Trump supporters, basically, in Australia. These Pauline Hanson ones have been coming out very strong against the Muslim community. And we're saying to them that our people knew these people. Our people knew what their God is about, you know, and what their teaching is about long before the white man ever came there. So in terms of the authenticity of uniting with heart, we unite with those people, especially with indigenous people around the world. It's like the Dalit people of this country, the Sufi, the Bala people here, Valis, all of them. We support those. We are in support of the arts with those people, not so much with the contemporary arts of the capitalistic commercial world. We want these people to come forward internationally and worldwide. It's like indigenous people are the ones to show the wisdom, the wiseness of what is a heart. It's not sustained in a wall, right? It's in the land. Right? It's not in a building, right? It's in the land. They try to put our people into museums, and we try to tell them, put us into churches and into temples and things. I'm not an atheist, you know, but the point is that our land, our bush, our sea, Yeah, that's all the church and a temple that we need, and that makes the heart pumps the thing, and the love. Love is most important to it all. And when you bring the love into it, you have to bring in your dream time before a white man came here. And when it's not reincarnation, it's just that you're going back there for like 6 months just before the white man came. You're grabbing that paradise and you're trying to bring it to the present day with all this war and with all this problems in society that Australia has that comes from international things. That love from 6 months ago, we can revitalize that and bring it back. And that's what I believe.
You have a very different entry point. I was thinking that, Lionel's position commits him to notions of the indigenous, the prior, the anterior. With you, it's your approach to, for lack of another word, India, has been through a certain kind of analytic prism. Your understanding of what the social psychology of this country might be. And I recur to an expression that you came up with a little earlier, the shadow selves and the shadow sides and the strengths of a culture. In the years you've been here, has that perception shifted? Have recent events shifted your sense of what is imminent within India? It's a kind of broadish question, but it refers to some of your work from about 10 years ago.
I would turn that question a little bit around because I don't know where that would lead us, actually. I think, I very much relate to what you're saying, that there are very, very different ways in today's art world how to relate to one's roots, to culture, and so on. I would totally disagree to try to divide people into, us and them, because I think in today's world that doesn't help us to address the issues that you face, but also other issues that society faces. So I would always strengthen dialogue. Dialogue in respecting that the arts, how you perceive them, how you also express them might be very different, but that we always find common ground, and that is, in a way, addressing issues that matter. Yeah, and that I find is very important. I find it also very important to bring humor back into art. To address issues by making people laugh or bringing it in a way in a different way, into throwing issues back into society in a different way by just making people then think about issues that they might not have thought before. Coming back to your question, are the shadow sides or dealing with the psyche of a culture, which I'm trying, my own as well as the culture I'm living in, it's constantly shifting. It's constantly shifting. There, for me, the issues of gender, for example, and sexuality are very important issues that I will continue to address but not just in India, everywhere. And it just, what I feel in the past 5 years is that there's more polarization. So, which makes it even more important to just throw things back into the different audiences.
Vidya, is it shifting ground or common ground? Speaking here of your own specific discipline, you spoke of the kind of marvelously hybrid situation that we now have, but there are these classical persistences. But arising out of these, what Lionel just said and what Katha just said, what sort of future do you envisage for, I'm going to use classical music for now as a sort of term. I don't know what it means any longer, but what sort of archives will the classical Indian music of the future draw on?
Actually, just to add to what the two of them said, I think music which has also risen from the classical world has stood for many, for want of anything else to say, I'm going to say causes. I'm going to put it in quote unquote. Because I think there has been, over the years, many artists, over generations, over centuries, artists have had their role to play in the political narrative as well. So, for instance, if you look at our dear neighbor Pakistan, a lot of musicians, a lot of trained classical musicians, moved around the time of partition. And what that did was straight away limited their options to perform. Few of them, in sheer frustration, came back, but some of them were frustrated and continued to live there. And there were efforts like the All Pakistan Music Conference and all that to create, performance possibilities. But in that political climate, it was exceedingly difficult to be able to do anything which was classical. So what did these musicians do? I mean, we know, for instance, the diva Roshanara Begum actually, in her memoirs, says she packed up her tanpura because she was totally frustrated with the fact that she couldn't sing. But then there were others like, Iqbal Bano and Nur Jahan and people like that who were seriously trained gharanedar musicians who took to Urdu poetry, therefore. And the ghazal, the way it blossomed, was partly because they brought a certain sense of, classicism or ragdari or whatever you call it, to poetry. So all that we continue to enjoy even after so many years. And, Iqbal Bano sang in the difficult times of Zia and was banned from public singing. So classical music has also dealt with this kind of turbulence in its own way. But it's interesting to see that in the current climate, how musicians want to seem to align. It's not that musicians have always, whether it was Dylan or whether it was Iqbal Bano, whoever, or Joanne Baez, there have been so many examples of how they have taken on challenges, they have stood for causes. But in the current climate, there is a certain, a very, let's say, a literal kind of an alignment that you see that is emerging from within the community of classical musicians, which makes me a little curious about, again, I'm going to go back to the same issue that I raised right at the beginning, because the state is a very important player in all of these arts that we're talking about. It's very important that there is a political commitment to, to just help for these art forms to grow. And that is becoming a bit dodgy now, which is actually my concern. Having said that, because of these other blurring of boundaries, I think new forms are emerging. Classical music is finding newer ways of expressing. And I personally feel, which could sound even blasphemous, but I do feel that every tradition should be, every generation should be allowed to define its idea of traditional. I think if we allow for that, there's going to be a lot of breathing space. And there's going to be many possibilities for, for all of us to happily survive, if not thrive.
I'm going to now open this up to the floor. And if people have questions for the panelists, is there a mic that can travel to the gentleman there?
You can use this one.
Yeah, sorry, a short question was, in the context of classical music, there was this gentleman named Bhatkande in the previous century. So do you actually think classifying arts is a means of taming that, or is it better off unclassified, as in raw?
Since the fest is about the man-woman thing, I mean, I think that man-woman thing, that man, Pandit Vishnu Narayan Bhatkande, it was also about control because, taking ownership of this phenomenal tradition. So more than classification, I think it was really about the idea of documenting, which he brought to Indian classical music like never before, was also done with the purpose of, it was almost like a copyright issue, you know. Who did it belong to? Who did it belong to? And by putting it into a documented form, that question was being addressed straight away. And therefore, it was questioning the historical beginnings of that tradition. So it was also an ownership thing, you know. It was about who it belonged to. So not just classification. Bandishes being documented has its relevance to the extent that at least we have some historical record of these songs. But the accuracy of that documentation is something that has been debated over the years. And I just want to add that in 1922, Bhatkande wrote a letter to a dear friend of his where he says, I'm really worried about the future of classical music. So some things are still with us.
Yeah, well, in Australia we got classical music too. In the Aboriginal community we have Bangara. Bangara is a theatre group in Sydney, and they just done a big tour in America there. They combine classical music, classical dancing, ballet dancing, all that with our culture, and introduce what struggle we're about in Australia, as well as the stolen generation, stolen land, and our rights to freedom, our rights over laws, our rights to our land and things like that. All brought into the classical theatre and using classical music for it. My cousin Stephen Page and David Page are pretty well known in Australia and also some parts of the world, in India too, for their classical kind of direction in terms of using classical music for what's happening in Australia. I mean, I find that very not hateful to me, but I see it as us and them. I don't care which way you say it, but it's the us and them. But if we can bring the us and them together in that way, like Shakespeare, for example, in Australia, is being used as a guiding post to use for our language. We develop our language and development. Some people in Western Australia now and in other places in Australia are using communities to use Shakespeare because we were brought up with all that colonialistic stuff, and now we are starting to use Shakespeare to use bits of our languages in that Shakespeare theatre as a classical kind of authentic way of bringing forward, revitalising to our culture. It's a strange thing for people who are just pro-culture in Australia, but we see it as this is a contemporary way in using classical stuff.
Wonderful. Sudhir, were you raising your hand or was okay. Any other questions? On which happy note? Unless you want to.
I'll sing two lines of a nazm that Faiz Ahmed Faiz had written, which was performed by Iqbal Banu. Following which, I mean, there's an iconic recording of this nazm where you can hear chants of Zindabad, Zindabad at the end of the rendition. So I would like to sing two lines from that. That's.